The title of this talk is Reconstructing a Theory of Islamic Architecture based on democracy, humanism, and finally the 8 reminders in a Muslim life. What I am attempting to do in this talk is to redefine, reinterpret, or reconstruct a theory of Islamic architecture from the values of the Sunnah or the Prophet's way of life within the construct of modern democracy and values of humanism inherent in Islam itself by outlining what I call the 8 reminders in a Muslim life. Thus, the approach is not like most other architects, but it is more of a value centered approach rather than the popular object centered one. The first message of this talk is Islamic architecture is trapped in an object centered discourse, and I am proposing that the value centered approach offers a more appropriate solution within the spirit of time, function, and place, and that the underlying foundation of it is the Sunnah or the Prophet's values and way of life, but interpreted within the sustainable design and technology with cultural dynamics as part and parcel of the whole package rather than a literal translation of the Sunnah into built form. What do I mean by a borrowed discourse of object-centered ideas? Object-centered ideas are, for instance, the approach of revivalism, as can be seen in the Perdana Putra Mosque in Putrajaya, where it is simply taking an object from a few Muslim countries in the past and pasting it up into a building. In this case, we can see traces of Iranian or Persian Islamic architecture and also others from the Muslim world. We also have other borrowed discourse of structuralism, which is also another popular way of handling Islamic architecture, which is to structuralize ornament into 3 dimension and placing it into a construct of space. Thus, we can see how the patterns has been now turned into structural ribs and columns. Geometricism is about, again, the use of ornament, which is said to be geometric, and it is 3-dimensionalized into built form, as can be seen in this building, which is the Islamic Center of North America, or ISNA. Another popular approach is the metaphor, which is used by certain architects. For instance, the idea of using the object of the Quran as the mosque, and this is a bit literal in its interpretation. Finally, we have also regionalism, which is a more competent approach that takes in the regional climatic characteristic of a place from the aspect of planning as well as the aspect of material into account. Now, all these are what I term as borrowed discourse. They have some popular strength as well as justification, but it is all restricted within their own confines. Now, the problem of this object-centered discourse can be seen in how design, if it is based purely on a historical typology, or shallow interpretation of modernist discourses may not suit the needs of contemporary times. Thus, when the initial ideas of buildings as a result of cultural needs and values are ignored, design ceases to be a contemporary process. Design is supposed to be a response to the needs of the users in the present context. History has its validity in design in terms of communication or the idea of memory, but if it is done purely for its own purpose and made to be forcing the plan and the use of function into a typology of history, that is where the problem comes in. A value centered approach is much better because, firstly, it does answer the question of architectural morality. Modern architecture, in actual fact, was based on many moral arguments or clash of values within the construct of technology, function, politics, and the environmental sustainability, or what I term here as natural sustainability. When the values of Christianity, as we can see in the works of Pugin, is interpreted within the aspect of technology and contemporary function, and we have what is known today as modern architecture. Postmodern architecture is not about rejecting modernistic values, but it is actually a reaction against misunderstood modernistic values. Because postmodern architecture is seen to be giving meaning back to architecture, where modern architecture was said to be taking meaning away and producing what is known as the machine or the product of technology purely. But in the works of Corbusier and Wright, who are both the masters of modern architecture, we can see meaning as part and parcel of their composition of architecture. Thus, Islamic architecture must be interpreted within the aspect of modernism and postmodernism, and to initiate its own clash of values in order to progress beyond simplistic revivalism or regionalism. What this means is that the socio-political values of a community, such as the Muslim or Islamic values, should be clashed against the idea of a modern nation with democratic values, humanistic ideas of organizing society, and this can result in terms of the planning of buildings and cities as well as the creation of form. To remind the audience about what is values in architecture, we can see here how Viollet-le-Duc clash the idea of morality of technology, in which technology is supposed to be resolved within the most economic construct. And if it can be done, for instance, like in the Dulles International Airport on the right, then it will produce a building worthy of the name art and architecture, instead of the building on the left, which simply copies some object or building in the past and simply reviving it and making it larger, but building it with concrete and making concrete emulate the characteristics of timber. Thus, the building on the left has no character, no integrity, but the building on the right has the greatest character integrity, which results in what is known as a beautiful building, but having integrity. Another quote by Pugin: pointed architecture does not conceal her construction but beautifies it. We can see that construction to be exposed is the moral thing to do, and we can see the integrity, dignity, and excellence of the building, which results from the consideration of construction and structure that produces the unique form that has character and value. Finally, we have the quote of Pugin again, saying that each geography, each society, each community has its own way of buildings, and therefore it should be respected. And thus, the idea of regionalism or the creation of architecture within the construct of the geography and technology available at a particular place. For instance, in Malaysia, use of timber and tropical architecture, falling water with the outcropping of rocks taking form, and also the composition of concrete, as well as in Hassan Fatih's adobe construction, modern adobe construction to build houses for the poor. Corbusier mentions that the plan of the building is the generator, because the plan is actually the form and arrangement of spaces that answers the modern and contemporary needs. And the plan is the one that then the elevation and the form results from, rather than um, a form that has already been decided. For instance, the Malay house, without even going through the plan, someone will just create a Malay house and turn it into an administrative building without looking at the functions and use and deriving a plan. Someone just plonk in an Egyptian style building of the past or an Ottoman style building of the past and calls it a mosque, adding on minarets and domes to be the language of the object of building. Now, in order to reconstruct the idea of Islamic architecture from my perspective, we need to have an idea about what is civilization. Islam is a civilized religion, and Muslims are supposed to be one of the best and civilized people. Islam is also not a stranger to the ideas of democracy and also nation building, meaning forming a new family of a country between different races, different tribes, different religions. Islam and the idea of the universal humanistic spirituality, or what is known as religion, although now religion has become ethnicized, has become politicized, and has become something that divides rather than something that helps in the understanding, acceptance, and tolerance of all. Religion becomes an identity construct that pits wars, that pits humans against another human. What is civilization and a civilized society? My answer is that a civilized society is a society of individuals or communities or citizens who respect one another's differences. This is important. Respecting each other's differences. And they resolve racial or political or cultural conflicts through rational and well mannered discourses. That's what parliament is supposed to be. But sometimes parliament becomes the place of hurling abuses and vulgar words by the elected representative. in order to gain popularity among the masses. A civilized society is one also which no member of the society shall suffer from a want of the basic necessity of life and dignified existence. Once a baby is born, the state or the people, regardless of the parents of that baby, must ensure its basic survival of food and shelter. If a person knows another family is hungry and does nothing, even though that person goes for prayer 5 times a day, that is not a civilized person. And even in Islam, the Prophet had said you cannot go to bed with your neighbor being hungry and you know about it. So, aside from having respect for each other, civilized society must prepare basic physical necessity for the survival of any one individual in that nation or society. Finally, a civilized society is one that affords freedom of individuals to aspire creatively through technology without undermining the economic and moralistic well-being of others. In some organization of society, people are classified into engineers, technologists, farmers. Uh, that is not, in one sense, civilized because it restricts the freedom of the individual to be creative. So, a civilized society is one that affords the idea of creativity. Now, there has been many discourses on what is the Islamic society in what is termed as Islamic reformist movement. One of the favorite idea of Islamic reformation was to change the modern constitution into a Sharia-based constitution in which the Quran and the Sunnah becomes the main basis for that constitution. Now, I disagree with that, even though I had supported it in my adult and young life, because the people who are said to be able to interpret are only the so-called ulama who are being educated in madrasah. But these people have no idea about planning, no idea about economics, no idea about art, engineering, technology, and so they have no justification for interpreting other people's needs in society. Dr. Farooq Musa is one of the Islamic reformists who has transcended the idea of the Sharia-based constitution by saying that Islam supports the idea of the civil state that fights for justice, for freedom of conscience, for freedom of expression, for good governance, separation of power, rule of law, respect for human rights, and economic equality. There are those who say that they are in Islamic country and even become the guardians of holy cities of Mecca and Medina, but practice injustice, practice restriction of expression, and practice the aspect of controlling power or over controlling power and disrespecting the dignity of human existence. But they call themselves Islamic. This is not actually in line with the values of the Prophet. Now, if we were to take this hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, in this hadith are the value system that can design a society and can put a different idea of planning for the city as well as suggestion of various building types that will be considered as Islamic architecture and city planning. Nowadays, Islamic city are judged by the form, whether they have domes, whether they are colored green, whether they have minarets, whether they have arches, whether they have mukarnas, whether they have decoration of geometric pattern. This is all false because they are only object centered, not value centered. If we are to be value centered, then we understand the values and produce whatever design or planning, and that then can be called Islamic architecture or Islamic city planning. Thus the hadith read, O son of Adam, I fell ill and you visited me not. He, Adam, will say, O Lord, and how should I visit you when you are the Lord of the world? He will say, did you not know that my servant so and so had fallen ill and you visited him not? Did you not know that had you visited him, you would have found me with him? Thus, the values of compassion by visiting the sick can produce various forms of actions in us, such as visiting, such as taking care of, and then we can produce objects like hospitals and elderly homes. That is a function of society because of compassion. We cannot leave anyone alone by themselves when they are in great need because that will become a sin. And here it is said that Allah said that if you did not tend to this person, then you have not done your duty, because if you had tended to this person, then you would become close to him. The next, O son of Adam, I asked you for food and you fed me not. He will say, O Lord, and how should I feed you? When you are the Lord of the world, he will say, did you not know that my servant so and so asked you for food and you fed him not? Did you not know that had you fed him, you would surely have found that there is the reward with me? O son of Adam, you gave me drink. I asked you to give me to drink, and you gave me not to drink. He will say, O Lord, how should I give you to drink when you are the Lord of the worlds? He will say, my servant so and so asked you to give him to drink, and you gave him not. Had you given him drink, you would have surely found that with me. Thus, here is about basic needs of food, and I interpret it also of shelter. And thus, we can ask the question, well, then how can we design a city with such need? Uh, Here in the past, we have various forms of buildings that caters to the needs of the travelers, like the khans or the caravanserai, and this has disappeared within the construct of the Islamic city. The caravanserais and khans are actually hotels which are free for people to come and stay after traveling very far, and also a place for the animals. Now, one aspect of Islamic architecture, to my mind, is its fitness to a democratic society. A democratic society is a society where the citizens own the country, sends their representative, but understanding that they are the masters of the country, and therefore they have a collective responsibility as well as an individual responsibility to the development of that society itself. It is a most powerful organizational tool in the development of the human experience, in which before this is simply aristocracy, what is determined by the aristocrats, like the kings, royalty, and the powerful. That's the characteristic of a democratic society, which is part of the Islamic value system. It's about mutual consultation and discussion. Whether you are Muslims or non-Muslims, we need to have a discussion about issues and the actions of the day, so that a mutual understanding and acceptance is reached and decisions are made. This is also part of the Islamic system. The intellectual members of the society must be the conscience for the masses. Unfortunately, in Malaysian public university, there is no conscience for the masses. The conscience of the intellectuals are only for themselves, for them to get promoted, for them to get grants, to travel, to have all the luxuries and perks of life. Nothing to do with being the conscience of the masses. In Islam, this is completely wrong. Knowledge comes with responsibility. And one of the responsibility, aside from acting out certain goodness, it is also spreading the goodness, which is communication. And this is the failure of Malaysian so-called public intellectual or intellectuals from public universities. They are not even public intellectuals. The leadership of the country in a democratic situation must understand that it is a temporal responsibility. It is not um, something that can be passed on to children like royalty. Thus, we can see that everyone has a role to play in a democratic society, and this can determine the shape of the city and the shape of the buildings, whether it is a mosque or an administration structure.
Now, in this slide, is a building
The building
called
on
the
this
Reichstag.
slide
It
is
is
the
the
Reichstag
German
building,
parliament.
which is
What happens is that
an
there's an
old
old building. It has
neoclassical
a dome, a
building
central dome.
in Germany
It is several hundred
that
years old,
is the
and this
German
was
parliament.
designed as the
When
parliament
the
building of
dome was
Germany.
destroyed in World
During
War
World War
II,
II, the
Norman
building was
Foster
partially
was given
destroyed,
the
and
responsibility
the dome
to
perhaps caved in,
make
and
a new adaptation.
competition was held
And for
how
me,
to renovate
this is
and complete this
the
building
best
as a historical
expression
monument,
of
as well as a
democratic
functioning
architecture I have
parliamentary
ever seen.
building. Uh, Norman Foster
Foster
got the
replaced
project,
the
and
masonry
he did
dome
a
of
wonderful
old
thing.
with a
He
glass dome
created
or a
what to
double
me
glass
is
dome,
the greatest symbol of
in which
democracy in architecture.
the
Now,
people or the
what did he do?
citizens are allowed
He
to
created a
travel up
glass
to the
dome,
roof of the
and the
building,
glass dome sits exactly
access
above the
through
assembly
the
hall,
glass dome,
where the parliamentarians
and
can be
are
seen
able to
by
view
citizens who
the
can go on top
parliamentarians
of the roof
debating
and look at the
underneath the
debate
dome
that is going on.
via
And
a
this,
closed
you could
secondary
see
dome
the picture
of
of people
glass.
going up the roof and circling
The act of the
the
citizen
dome, which
looking
has
down onto
a
the
double layer
elected
dome,
representative
one that has a space,
is
and
the
then there's
most
another dome over the assembly hall.
powerful statement of
This is a
democracy I
great
have ever
symbol in
witnessed.
which the citizen is above,
In
at the top
Islam,
of the
leadership is a
parliamentarians, and
responsibility. It
also
is not a
looking over,
privilege and it
and
is
that
not a tool
presents the
towards wealth.
strongest symbols of democracy,
The
which
hadiths are
reminds
very
us that
clear
it
on
is
the
us,
aspect of
we are the one, we are the kings, and
asking
those are the
accountability
representatives.
as a leader
As opposed to nowadays, where we would
to
term
all those
people yang
who
berhormat and
become
amat
what is
berhormat,
known
and
as
although these are
the elected
uh,
representative of
some
the people.
culturally initiated
Thus,
terms, but
from my
we go
perspective,
overboard.
the
We
Rishta
give too much respect,
contains
and some
elements of
disrespect actually
Islamic
is
architecture,
supposed to be
even though
not
it doesn't have domes
commensurate
or
to the
minarets
peace that
or
is coming.
mukarnas, but the values that it represents about the relationship between the people and the elected representative is clearly part of the Islamic value system. In the story of Islam, Omar ibn Khattab was asked questions in the mosque or even criticized for certain things that he had done. And that is part and parcel of the Islamic responsibility. As long as the adab or the manners of engagement can be clear. In a separate lecture, I had given the idea of representation, accountability, and accessibility. That is the nature of the democratic society and the architecture characteristics that should accompany it. If we were to look at the three buildings on the right, there is nothing populistically Islamic in any of this because there are no domes, there are no minarets, there are no calligraphy or whatnot. But on the left, we could see all the emblems of Islamic populism, the domes, the ornamentation, massing. All of these are the trappings of populism or populist architecture that is deemed quote unquote Islamic. In this talk or in my concept, the buildings on the right are Islamic, whereas the buildings on the left is clearly un-Islamic. Now, in my talk about religion, I always touch on the idea of humanistic spirituality. The problem of religion in the world nowadays is that it is an identity construct. People concentrate too much on being Christians, being Muslim, being Hindus, being Buddhist, to the point that political conflicts, to the point that racial conflict, to the point that cultural conflict occurs. When in fact, religion, if we were to study it in an objective manner, is simply a humanistic spirituality that transcends all the boundaries of identity politics or identity society. The highest sense of spirituality is about feeling that you have harmony in all races, cultures, and religions. That is very impactful in terms of city planning as well as architecture. Secondly, spirituality means you are at one with all the living things, the environment, not to be against it, not to be exploitative of them. If we follow the hidden ways of exploitation, and that's why we have the threat of global warming, the threats of overpollution, and so many aspects that is going to be harmful to all humanity. We are also at one with the environment and the landscape that not only brings food, but the sense of beauty, peace to us. But we destroy them in place of cities. And I've always mentioned that the planning that shows greatness of the landscape and nature is Islamic. Finally, we are at one with our ego self, thinking self, and eternal self. We have all these three selves in our own body and soul, and there is a harmony in all of them, and not the slave of one. For instance, the slave of an ego self, or the slave even of the thinking self. And both of them being in harmony would lead the eternal self to be more in dominance. We can only be at one with the creator if we are at one with all these humans, races, the living things, the environment, and even with ourselves. Then only we could say that we are religious or spiritual. One of the strongest architecture statement about spirituality is not in the church, but in this building, which is falling water. Look at how it sits within nature. It is in harmony with nature. It doesn't interrupt the waterfall. It gives humans to experience nature directly in its own bosom. And we can see the rock outcroppings or the stones being used in contrast with the modern concrete construction. It completes the picture. It does not dominate or violates the picture. This is the aspect of Islamic architecture that is unknown to many. Although people will say that this Frank Lloyd Wright is not a Muslim, and therefore this architecture cannot be said to be Islamic. I totally disagree with this idea, because if we were to look at a value-centered discourse, then we will find emancipation or freedom in thinking beyond what is known as populist Islamic architecture. This slide shows the picture of a mosque designed by a student. At one glance, we don't even know that it is a mosque, because there are no domes, there are no minarets to start with. But it is a mosque nonetheless. It is designed with the center of the whole site to be a bazaar, an open air bazaar with a covered roof, and it sits in front of the mosque proper, which is the biggest building block here. The rest of the smaller building blocks are subdivided into various facilities, such as a reading room, uh, storage for food, a place for people to be homeless to sleep, and clinics and various sorts. We have to see now that the mosque is open in all directions. It is open so that people, anybody, Muslims and non-Muslims, can come and buy things at the bazaar. And the bazaar is closed during prayer times and continues after that. We come now to my construction of the theory of Islamic architecture by using the basic principles of Islamic values. First of all, a Muslim must possess the values and not merely focus purely on the ritualistic form. If we look at the mosque, the emphasis on the prayer space is an emphasis on ritual. 80% of the money is spent there to embellish it, to make it beautiful, and I think this is not correct. This is money not worth spending. It should be more to the ancillary functions that helps the community grow, and not to say such things like to beautify the buildings with expensive materials to please God. God is not pleased with this. God is only pleased when we are pleased with each other or develop each other. The political and social and economic life values from the Sunnah of the Prophet are essential to adapt and adopt modern systems of governance, finance, and socio-economic activities within a democratic and multicultural society. So the values of Islam is part and parcel of the political, social, and economic life, and it has no issues with democracy and multicultural living. Now, some people will say, no, Islam is not that. It must be on top. It must be the dominant force. It must control multiculturalism so that Islam shall be safeguarded. This is wrong thinking. Islam does not need to be guarded. If something is good, it in itself is guarded. Nothing else should guard it. It is like a person who is good, excellent at what he or she does, will always find jobs, will always find meaning, will always find roles in society. The planning and design of cities and buildings can be derived by considering the Sunnah and modern lifestyle. There are people who considers the Sunnah as related to Saudi Arabia or Arabian architecture and simply take on the characteristics of these Arabian cities, like the use of the mashrabiyah and all this. The use of mashrabiyah is the idea of privacy. It can be done in many, many ways. Mashrabiyah was the traditional way of the Arab people. So, taking on the mashrabiyah doesn't ensure that it is Islamic, but the planning and the use of other materials in order to realize the value system, that would be Islamic. Thus, my theory of Islamic architecture can be looked at from these 8 reminders. I have used this aspect from my involvement with the Islamic reformist group, in which I had learned a lot from being a Muslim. And one of the aspects of the reformist group is to make Islam as a part of life, not as an isolation from life. And so, this fundamental principle of Islamic architecture must be understood of what makes a good Muslim. If one does not understand what makes a good Muslim, then how can one create an architecture that is so quote unquote Islamic? First of all, the Muslim must remind himself or herself of God all the time. And how do you do that? We will see. Reminder of ibadah, of perjuangan, meaning strife. Strife here, perjuangan here means to be concerned about what's happening in the larger society and not to be only isolating yourself in the mosque or in your house and just concentrating on rituals. This is not the way of Islam. Islam requires a perjuangan. A reminder of life hereafter is about thinking about the continuation of life, its accountability, and also its um, peaceful existence, both in this world and in the next. Humility is a very strong characteristic of Islam. Muslims are not arrogant. Muslims don't think that they are better than others. Muslims are supposed to be the most humble of people, but it doesn't mean that they are pushovers. It doesn't mean that they can turn the other cheek. This is not an Islamic value system, but Muslim is always humble. Muslims are always reminded about wakaf and public welfare, as with the idea of perjuangan. Perjuangan is doing things, is fine, but giving to the public in terms of lasting things. Perjuangan you can only do when you're alive. Wakaf and public welfare are things that you leave after you die. Those are the things that continues your good works. Reminder of cultural tolerance. Islam tolerates many things, but the world nowadays, we can see Islam being intolerant of so many things, even very small things. Issue of the laundry, issue of non-Muslim barbers, issue of insulting prophets. These are all shows the intolerance of Muslims. But in reality, Muslims are supposed to be tolerant. An intolerant Muslim on very simple issues or issues that are supposed to be non-issues. For instance, the Jawi issue, showing complete intolerance to the point that the Jawi is supposed to be representative of Islam. Jawi is just a script, nothing more, nothing less. it has the same value as the Indian script, the Chinese script, the Roman script, whatever script. It's just a tool. But some people believe that it is more than that. And that is why we have cultural conflicts, religious conflict. Reminder of sustainability, the idea of Muslims being a guardian for the world, for the future. There is this concept of Khalifa or Khilafah, of which the Muslim believe the world is simply a place of trust by God to man, and they are supposed to return the trust into the best possible condition. The sustainability of the environment and architecture is an Islamic aspect. Accountability is very important because the Prophet Muhammad had warned many times against wastage of funds, whether it is your own funds, the more so it is the public's funds. Prophet have said things about not wasting things, and he is very hard against those who waste things. Even his wife, he was very hard on them in terms of his reminders. And so, if we can understand the state of mind of the Muslim from these 8 uh, values or reminders, then only can we understand how to plan and how to build Islamic architecture. And now, in the Quran, there are many verses that ask Muslims to remind themselves of God. Now, how do we remind ourselves of God when we cannot see God? The Quran says to see what God has produced, meaning His work, handiwork, meaning the plants, the trees, the landscape, the rivers, the lakes. This came on before humans were put on this earth. Humans add on buildings, and that is not God's creation. Therefore, that is not a reminder of God. And so, nature, as Wright says, is the only body of God that you will ever see, is the prime importance about a reminder of God. So in any Islamic city or any Islamic complex, if nature is being shown off, then that will become Islamic architecture. But if we see in Putrajaya and in many Islamic cities, nature becomes subservient, and the things that are displayed are the expensive domes and minarets and ornamentation. These are supposed to be reminders of the greatness of God. I do not take that position. Because if you can see in this verse of the Quran that he who spreads out the earth and set their own mountains standing firm, flowing rivers, this is it, reminding about the creations of God, which is nature. And these two buildings on the left and the right are in contrast to each other. One of them show off nature, be humble to nature, and that to me is Islamic architecture. Whereas the other makes nature subservient and the building of man to be more dominant, and that to me is not Islamic architecture. Whether it has 5 or 20 domes, or whether it paints the building green, or whether it has Allah all around it in its calligraphy, it is not to me the best form of Islamic architecture. The second is the reminder of ibadah or perjuangan. A picture shows a demonstration of students against a political strength, and the other one is helping the old people. This is part and parcel of the Muslim life. He cannot run away from this. This is a responsibility that must be met. Thus, we can see that the Quran contains verses about prayer and sadaqah. Sadaqah is charity. Prophet have said charity can be giving money, giving properties, giving your time, giving your strength, or even giving a smile. It is always mentioned with salat. Salat is the personal ritual to God only. It's not supposed to be shown to man. It's not supposed to be salaried. You pray because you have to pray, not because someone pays you a salary and calls you a mufti. This is the idea of perjuangan in sadaqah. And so the acts of communal obligations, there are many community obligations, as well as fighting for the cause of Islam to the very end, or jihad in the sense of warfare or protection of livelihood, properties, as well as the religious faith. In the hadith that exemplifies this value system, we can see that the Prophet said, "Shall I not inform you something more excellent than fasting, prayer, and almsgiving?" Prophets. People ask what, and he said, "It is putting things right between people." So, a community responsibility is more important than prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. And so, this shows that the Muslim must be active in society. Prophet have also said, "He who separates the community within a span takes off the noose of Islam from his neck," meaning that the Muslim cannot be a monastic person. Monasticism is disallowed in Islam unless there is clear threat of the society on Islam. Then and only then you are allowed to stay away from the society, because it has become too toxic and it has become too antagonistic. Now, how does this all translate into architecture? Well, we could see here one example is to show off the houses of God, because it is only here that symbolizes you having to play a role in community. To serve God is to play a role in community. And one of the buildings that shows this is the houses of worship. Because if you work as a civil servant, you are being paid for it, and therefore it has nothing to do with spirituality. But doing work for the service of God, doing the work in community without a salary, that is the line of spirituality. And so all houses of God should be shown off, and that shows the planning of cities must take into account the development of spaces next to houses of worship in order to honor them. And many times in Malaysia, mosques are being honored in this way, but other buildings like churches, like temples, are not being honored. And this must change, because Islam is fair to all. On this issue, also, I always like to quote Satya Narayan Goenka, the man who created the Vipassana meditation practices all around the world. When he was giving a speech in the United Nations and people were quarreling about the issue of conversion, from Muslims to Christian, from Christians to Muslims, and these factions of people were arguing against each other. Goenka says, do not talk about converting Muslim to Christian or Christian to Muslim. Talk about converting people from ignorance to knowing. Talk about converting people from being indifferent to being compassionate, and talk about people from being intolerant to being tolerant. Now, that is the better spirituality, not religious identity. In this Quranic verse, it is said that our sustainer knows that we have indeed been sent unto you, but we are not bound to do more than clearly deliver the message entrusted to us. So the Muslims supposed to be a very tolerant people because they are there to send a message, a clear message, through their actions of good deeds, through their actions of good speeches, through their actions of good manners, not political motivated actions, not financial constraints, not other things. This is what tolerance is about in Islam. Other aspects of creating the reminder of perjuangan is to make the mosque or houses of worship having more of the other ancillary functions rather than just concentrating on the ritual prayer space. We see in the cathedrals how much is spent to beautify and aggrandize or making it grandiose the spaces of prayer. Why? Because it is said to be for God. As I said, God has no interest in making anything beautiful or good in the sense of pleasing Him, because He is beyond being pleased on that. Goodness comes from when you are being good to other people, and therefore that signifies the other functions. The functions of having a reading room for children who has no reading room. The functions of having a free clinic for those who cannot sort paid medication. The function of having a good shelter for those who do not have any home. These are the aspects of spirituality, not the great domes, not the great prayer spaces, not the great or expensive ornament, not the expensive material. That is nothing to do with Islamic values. But this is what is happening in the country of Malaysia, a Muslim nation, and also in other countries that says that they are Islamic. The mosque in its prayer space is being aggrandized while there are people who have no food on the table. Next is the reminders of the life hereafter. Since we cannot see the hereafter, I have proposed that the gateway to the hereafter, which is the cemetery, to be looked at very seriously. I think I am the only one who talks about the aspect of planning of cemeteries to be an important consideration in Islamic cities. Many people simply put aside the idea that the cemetery is just to bury somebody. I've always said that the cemetery is not important to the dead person, because the dead person don't care where it's buried. You can bury the dead person anywhere, and they don't have any physical sense to be angry, to be embarrassed, or to be indignified, or to be in indignity. We can see that to me, the cemetery is for the living. How the living treat the dead will determine how they treat those people who are living. If they treat the dead well, in terms of saying that, okay, well, it is the gateway to another world, another lifetime, a lifetime of peace and accountability, then they will treat those in the present life better. So we show you I show you two cemeteries. One is the Muslim cemetery on the bottom, and the Chinese cemetery at the top. The Chinese cemetery, of course, pays a lot of money to those who take care of the cemetery. They perform their rituals because they believe that the dead ancestors may have an influence or will have an influence on them in the present life. Now, the Muslims in the cemetery simply buries people there, and there doesn't seem to be any attempt to show this as a transitory place before we go to the hereafter. In Islam, it is known as the barzakh. The barzakh is the transition period between the living and the life hereafter, which is the dead. The dead lives in a barzakh world where there are already some things going on in the barzakh. In the hereafter, all the souls in the barzakh will become alive in a different world and feel the pain and feel the remorse and feel the fear in the hereafter. It is a different world than the barzakh. Because my idea about the Islamic city and Islamic architecture is that each city would make its cemetery visible to the people who is going about their daily life. For instance, going to work, going to shopping, going to send children to school, going to recreation. They must pass by a cemetery in order to be reminded of the life hereafter. Most municipalities would cover up the cemetery. I noticed that the municipality of Johor would cover up and plant landscaping in order to hide the view of a Chinese cemetery. But I think all cemeteries should be visible once at least by a person traveling to their daily life. Now we can see that you can travel to all these places of work, play, and prayers, but you will never pass by a cemetery. You only come to a cemetery when someone dies, then you follow them, and then you will discover where the cemetery is. And I don't think this is the right way to design or plan cities. We can see here in Islam how the Prophet um, has left a legacy in which when the funeral path or when the funeral procession comes, then you will make dua or prayer for the dead person. That shows that there must be maximum exposure of the procession to the people. So in the olden days, this is done by walking, uh, taking the coffin um, across the village to the burial site, because the burial site is always next to a village. Nowadays, with zoning regulation, the cemetery is being given uncommercial places, and so that means further away from the city. And thus, the dead body is packed up in a car and driven 20 kilometers away to a burial site. No one can say a prayer for the people. So, the best way is to include the cemetery as part of the city planning, not isolated from the main part of the city. And it becomes not only a pathway that you would go every day, but it is also a place where when there is a dead a person being taken to the ceremony, people can have a reminder about their mortality, as well as their accountability, as well as their spirituality of saying a small prayer for the soul of the dead. Next is the reminder of humility. Muslims are humble people. They are humble in terms of knowledge, meaning the more knowledgeable you are, the more humble you become, not more arrogant. The more wealthy you are, the more humble you become. The more powerful in politics you are, the more humble you have to be with the people. And this humility can be best expressed in architecture by looking at the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, as I have mentioned here or placed here, how Wright places buildings within nature rather than against nature or in dominant. One of the strongest hadiths about this value system of humility is in this story or hadith of the Prophet, where a man came to a group of people in Medina. He came to talk to the Prophet and he asked the group of people, who is the one called Muhammad? And the group of people pointed to a man sitting down amongst them. The Prophet was indistinguishable. He was a person like any other person. He did not have a red carpet. He did not have a procession. He did not have a line of statues. He did not have a throne. He sat with the people in the most humble manner. There was also a hadith in which the Prophet one day went to the mosque and then noticed the absence of a person who keeps the mosque clean, and said, where is this person? And they said that he or she has died. So the Prophet said, why didn't you tell me? He said, well, it's just a person who keeps the mosque clean. The Prophet asked where she was buried, and he went to pray at her grave. Now, prayer at the grave is actually prohibited by the Prophet himself. Um, this is simply done because the Prophet wishes to show his respect to this person, because he was not told of the death of the person. And there was a case of another person who died, and the Prophet was not told, and then the Prophet performed the prayers. Which shows that the Prophet is humble in relation to his uh, ties with the. When the Prophet died, they would talk about making a tomb or a monument to him, but it is quashed by Aisha when the Prophet clearly forbade that any tomb or great building be put onto the burial place of the Muslim. This is again a sign of humility. Another hadith shows how when Omar ibn Khattab went up to see the Prophet at one time, he saw the Prophet sitting amongst very meager furniture, to the point that the Prophet was sitting on a mat, and his back shows the impressions of the mat onto his body. And the Prophet said to Ibn Khattab, when Ibn Khattab said, you are the Prophet, why has Allah given you this kind of meager living, while the khosrows and the kings live in opulence? And the Prophet said that this is not the purpose of life, to be in great palaces or great cars and things like that. It is about spirituality. It is about the inner satisfaction that is greater than any material possession. Because any material possession, you will never be enough. Only inner peace can determine what we need in this world, rather than letting the world decide for us what we need in it. Thus, the architectural expression of monumentality, of axis, of setbacks, of approaches, grand approaches, that we see a lot in royal architecture, that we see a lot in dictatorships, that we see a lot in politicians who think that they are not the representative of the people, but representative of themselves. So such architecture is not Islamic architecture. It is an architecture of arrogance. It is not the architecture of humility. In this slide, on the left, it is shown the Broadacre City model by Frank Lloyd Wright, and on the right is the Sinat Salo Town Hall by Alva Alto. Yes. Okay. So a Broadacre City, if we were to look at the aerial view, you cannot see which part is the administration. I cannot tell. And the fact that the Wright had done it this way shows that he thinks that the uh, federal power or the power of the people or the administration is about serving the people, not serving itself. If you look at Putrajaya, you can clearly see the lines, the axis, and the setbacks and the places of power. You can name them, you can see them very clearly. So that shows that they are serving themselves. They are not serving the people. In Broadacre City, because they serve the people, that's why they blended in the environment. Similarly, with the Sinaselo Town Hall, it looks like a building like any building. It doesn't look imposing, it doesn't look arrogant, it doesn't look isolated from others. It is part of the street. It has a geometry and massing that is not hierarchical so much, and it has a plaza inside for the people to gather to express certain will or issue. And thus, both to me, this architecture is Islamic, even though they were designed by non-Muslims. The reminder of Wakaf is related directly to public welfare. The Wakaf is the strongest statement of individual sacrifice to the community. The hadith of the Wakaf says that if a Muslim dies and leaves a legacy of knowledge or property or even an offspring that will do good deeds, then all the deeds will be given the reward to the person, even though he or she has already died. In the past, many Muslims have given wakaf of mosques, of places to rest like Caravanserai or Khan, and in the case of Malaysia, it is called the Pondok Wakaf, for people to sit, pray, or rest against the strong heat of the sun. Now, in many of our public cities or in our country, in fact, you do not see such public buildings or wakaf buildings. We see, of course, houses of worship, and sometimes these are used by the poor, the homeless, or the musafir, which is the travelers. But we don't see them a kind of buildings that people can go to take a bath, to rest, to sleep a while. We don't see that. And this shows an uncivilized city. In a Muslim city, it have to be at a mosque. It should be a kind of a free hotel type of building for people to actually come and use for a minimal fee, very minimal, or for no fee at all. This would be a true Islamic city. In the hadith of the Prophet, there are many instances where Muslims would give um, food as well as other necessities of life, and they are collected at mosque or they are being given away. And these are the aspect of value system that is very critical in Islam. It shows that Islam is concerned about the welfare of the public or community at large, and it doesn't say that it has to be only for Muslims only. Thus, these values should come with an architecture or a building that should be planned in this manner, or it should be part of a building like a madrasa or a mosque that provide the service of welfare to the community. The Prophet have said that doing welfare work or making uh, the community more comfortable, such as blessed is the wealth of Muslim from which he gives to the poor, the orphans, and the needy travelers. And the Quran also says such things about spirituality. Spirituality is not about sitting in a mosque praying all the time. It is mostly about helping the poor or helping the orphan, helping the musafir, the travelers, and it doesn't stipulate whether the poor, the orphan, or the traveler are Muslims or not Muslim. This is the generosity of Islam. It's tolerant and it's compassion, and this needs to be shown in built form. In Islam, there is also the rights of the guest. If a person asks to stay at a house, then the Muslim must oblige him or her 3 days of obligatory being a guest, being having food, having a shelter. And that's why when I travel in the United States, we would stay at the mosque because the mosque would allow us a cheap place to stay rather than at a hotel where they would just say that brothers and sisters, you are welcome to stay here for free using the water, the electricity, the heating for 3 days. And after 3 days, they ask that amount of $10 US to be donated to the mosque. And so this aspect of taking care of the guests is reflected in the caravanserai of the old city of Islam. And this is the part of planning which I think would distinguish the Islamic city from other cities. I have quoted this hadith before in which Allah says to Adam, I was sick and you did not come and see me. And then Adam said, how can I see you? You are God. Said, look, if you visit the sick, then you will find me with you. Then God says, I was thirsty and you did not give me to drink. And then the Adam or man would say, how can we make you drink? You are God. God said that if you provide someone who is thirsty, then you will find yourself with me. And so this is also part of the idea of public welfare, and this value is strongly embedded in Islam. As with the neighbor hadith, none amongst you believes till one likes for his brother or for his neighbor that which he loves for himself, which is part of the universal contract of do unto others as you would do unto yourself. So if you live next to a neighbor, your stomach is full, but the neighbor is hungry, and you are not a very good Muslim, or you do not have faith in Islam. You must have make the neighbor feel as comfortable as you are. Thus, in the public realm, there are also values such as greeting people, lowering the eyes, removing anything that is injurious. This is part and parcel of the public life of the Muslim. It is also part and parcel of city planning. For instance, there are many crimes nowadays with motorcycles snatching and hurting people. And so there is a way for architecture to address this issue in terms of the design of the sidewalk that is safer. And this then can become part of the Islamic city plan. Islam does not make monoculturalism as a fact of its religion. Islam does not look at race or the color of one's skin. One can be of any other race and one can also believe in Islam. And so the multifaceted aspect of Islam in terms of its cultural tolerance is well documented in the hadith, in which the Prophet have no problem with people of other cultures. And in Indonesia, we can see the spread of Islam from the Wali Songo, who respect certain cultures or cultural aspect, or transform those cultural aspects into that of Islamic heritage. In this hadith of the Prophet, where some people or girls were singing and playing musical instruments, of which Abu Bakr had forbidden them. But the Prophet said, let them, because they are from a certain tribe who love this sort of thing. Then there was the incident in which the Prophet allowed his wife Aisha to look from behind him the actions of the sword, the spear played by the Abyssinians, who are noted for this weapon. The Prophet once stood up when a funeral procession passed, but then the Muslim said that this is not a Muslim, he is a Jew. But the Prophet said that he too has a soul and need to be prayed on. It shows that the Prophet was very tolerant of other cultures, unlike Muslims nowadays who are intolerant of different cultures. They would speak of these other cultures as drinking alcohol, practicing different kinds of sexual relationship, and they would abhor them and treat them as people who are dirty or as an enemy. But the Prophet had never done such a thing. There was also an incident in which the Prophet advised those who lead people in prayer to make it short, because he said among them are the women who has to breastfeed their babies. There are also the old who cannot stand up very long, and there are also those who have business to attend. And so he is saying that you must take into consideration the context of your uh, congregation. And this also includes the idea of being tolerant. Uh, the idea of sustainability or reminder of sustainability, as I said, is related to the concept of man as Khalifa or vicegerent, in the sense that he is the guardian of the world for a future generation. He is not supposed to destroy the world. It is like renting an apartment where if you want your deposit back, you have to return the apartment in its original state. One aspect of this reminder can be seen in Prophet's declaration that the whole world is a prayer space. And I have always said that the mosque that is built worth hundreds of millions of ringgit is nothing more than a facility. One does not need a mosque. What one needs is one, prayers together in a congregation, and it can occur anywhere on this earth. And one needs to meet and discuss and organize society for the betterment for everyone. And so the mosque is a facility, not a requirement. When we plant trees, fruits, and things of that nature, we are actually providing um, the environment with the badly needed aspects of sustainability, and it can lessen pollution, which helps make life better. And this aspect is an Islamic. So the Sustainable Development Goal that is created by the United Nations, to me, all of its 17 goals are Islamic. None of them shows that Islam is against any of it, because all of it is to look at the world as a sustainable place of existence for all. This aspect of sustainability can be recorded with the Prophet saying that if you um, can clean up a cemetery or a sheepfold and turn it into a mosque, it is permissible. It shows that the Prophet allows such things to be used if there is a necessity for it. For instance, in Hong Kong, where there is very little space, or in Singapore, then Islam, in terms of its cemetery requirement, is different. It cannot have a cemetery for one person for a long time, like in Malaysia. Um, this can be reused after a certain number of years has passed, and that is part and parcel again of the sustainable aspect of reminder of accountability. Must be held to both the Muslims and the leaders of the Muslim. The leaders of the Muslim must be accountable in its management of the public funds, but the people are also accountable to the actions of the leaders of the people. It must be mutually understood that both will be in sin when misappropriation of funds is being done. The leader will be in sin with Allah, but also the people in a democracy who is supposed to remind these leaders about their sinful acts. There are hadiths in which the Prophet reminds the Muslim not to be wasteful, but this is not to be interpreted as Islam being against beauty or decorations and such. It is only saying that you need to be very careful. For instance, when a mosque is built with more than one minaret, or even with a minaret, questions must be asked. Can the money to build the minaret be used for the goodness of the people? If there are still people who are hungry, without shelter, children not going to schools, then the person who instruct the mosque to be built of minarets, which is an extra thing, can be held accountable by Allah in saying that why shouldn't you use the money of this minaret for the poor? If everybody is taken care of, then that may be permissible to have some aspects of decoration to a building. Every Muslim is accountable for all their deeds and actions. They have to account for the things that they have done. They have to account for the money that they have spent on themselves, on the family, on the community, everything. Even on things that may not seem related to them, for instance, removing injurious object, they are also accountable. Do you see the injurious object? Yes. Can you remove it at that particular time by your own self? Yes or no? If it is yes, then you need to remove it. But if it is no, then you need to have an impression that you should report this to someone to remove it. And so all these are accountable, and deeds of excess is not looked upon as something which is uh, forgiven in Islam. There was a hadith in which the Prophet had admonished a person who was building a dome that he deemed as a decorative element in his building. And so he said that every building is a misfortune for its owner except what cannot, meaning except what cannot be done without, meaning it has to be with a certain function that is needed, that is not something that is extra. However, as I said, this has nothing to do with beautifying your house or buildings, except that the money must be justified, that there are no other people who are in need of that fund. The hadith of the Prophet, if anyone wears a garment for gaining fame, Allah will clothe him in a similar garment on the day of resurrection. Meaning that will be a poisonous cloth for this. These are more hadiths in which the Prophet advised against being too arrogant, wasteful, or vain in our expressions and display of our personal self. This can also be interpreted in architecture to mean not to have too much elements that cannot be justified to be pragmatically needed. Thus, we see in the architecture of the flats, for instance, how architects have designed buildings with the corridor that allows children to fall from it. When you allow that thing to occur, then you are part and parcel of those who did not remove injurious objects. A person like me who understands it must write and tell people, and I have done so, that we should not design corridors in this manner. Architects should reorganize the design so that it will be safer for children. If you do not do that, then you are accountable in the hereafter. Similarly, the architect of the Putra Pradana has not put in a sun shading device, and therefore the building has very expensive cooling loads. And this is the public funds. Therefore, the architect as well as the administrator will both be held accountable. And this kind of architecture is not Islamically conscious of. Thus, to sum up, the idea of Islamic architecture and planning is on the eternal values of the Sunnah, which are represented in Hadith and the Quran. We have gone through them. These are the values. But we need to also understand the critical aspect of architectural theory, like organic architecture. Some say this is not Islamic. Why? Just because the person is not a Muslim. But you could look at the value in which the organic architecture plays in the idea of the values of Islam, and you could consider that as Islamic. There is also the understanding of the contemporary purpose of the building, a sustainable approach, a socio-political conscience of something that would benefit the many, and a clear understanding of the values in the modernism is required in transforming the values of the Sunnah and the ideas or the values of the Quran into what is called Islamic architecture and planning.